The year is 2184 BC. King Pepi II, now at the ripe old age of 90, lies on his deathbed. For over 7 decades he ruled the vast lands of Egypt. His kingdom stretched from the Nile Delta in the north to the far reaches of Nubia in the south. Pepi II was the ruler with the longest reign in the entire history of Egypt. There is not a man left alive who remembers the time before he ascended the throne. With his last breath, however, Egypt will never be the same again. The story of the first transition period, the darkest era in Egypt's history, begins. For centuries, the Old Kingdom of Egypt was notable for its remarkable stability. The kings, or pharaohs, as they were also known, ruled with divine authority. They built colossal monuments like the Great Pyramid of Giza to proclaim their power in perpetuity. But toward the end of the 6th dynasty, cracks began to appear in Egypt's unshakable foundations. It all started with the long reign of King Pepi II. In those days, without the aid of modern medicine and decent hygiene, to live to such an age was both a miracle and a curse. Some saw in him a living god, a man touched by eternity. Others whispered that he was more spirit than man, clinging to life far past his time. But the truth was one. The longer he reigned, the weaker he became, and Egypt weakened with him. The duties of kingship were many and arduous: negotiating alliances, settling disputes, religious campaigns, commanding armies. These were not tasks for a man who could barely lift his head. When Pepi II finally breathed his last, all Egypt heaved a sigh of relief. It didn't last long, however, because his son and successor, Merenre II, was already an old man and had reigned only a year and a month before he died. He was the last pharaoh of the 6th dynasty. After his death, Egypt began to fall apart. The central power that held the empire together was already broken, leaving a dangerous and chaotic vacuum. It was this void that the Nomarchs exploited for their inroads. These regional governors saw an opportunity to grab power for themselves and began to tear Egypt apart between their own dominions. Thus began the darkest era in Egypt's history. But the Nomarchs were not the only culprits of this dark period. Nature also contributed to the catastrophe that occurred. The sky over Egypt grew heavy, the air became dry, and the fields cracked and barren. The Egyptians of the time saw this as a bad omen and believed that the gods were punishing them for their mistakes. But the reason was far more prosaic. Today, scientists explain this disaster with atmospheric pressures and altered monsoon currents. An area of low pressure formed over Central Asia, diverting the rains from their usual path. Moist winds from the Indian Ocean shifted towards the Himalayas and left much of Africa, including Egypt, in a relentless drought. The consequences were devastating, to say the least. Worse still, the crops that fed this mighty kingdom, such as peas, lentils, olives, and grapes, were disappearing. In their place, a plant few of us know today began to sprout in the fields: bitter vetch. This hardy bean could grow even on poor, almost lifeless soil. But its name was no accident. It tasted bitter, and the plant itself was toxic. Eating it was a desperate measure, the silent cry of a civilization on the brink of ruin. Nearly 70 years after the death of King Pepi, the second passed in turmoil. Time, as usual, had left its mark, and now a man named Wakare sat on the throne. Actually, sat is perhaps too strong a word. His power was as fragile as an eggshell. He ruled not from the ancient heart of Egypt, Memphis, but from Het-Nesut, a smaller city closer to his native land. This was a clear sign of his weakness. He needed the comfort of familiar surroundings to maintain what little control he had. But a king without his castle is just a man with a crown. By then, the golden age of the pharaohs, when a ruler's word could move mountains, had passed. The lack of a strong centralized government enabled ambitious men to pursue their own goals. They raised armies, levied taxes, and created their own fiefdoms. One of these men was Anktifi, the lord of Nekhen. Anktifi was a very ambitious man. He allied himself closely with Wakare, using his weakened power as a shield as he pursued his own dreams of conquest. He wanted it all. He dreamed of uniting the south under his rule and took aim at Thebes. But dreams often collided with reality, and Anktef's ambitions were soon to hit a wall of unexpected obstacles. What he did not know was that Thebes was by no means an easy target. The city was ruled by a man named Intef, a ruler as hard and steadfast as the rocks on the banks of the Nile. To further complicate matters, Intef was also an ally of Pharaoh. He foresaw the storm on the horizon and fortified his city for the inevitable clash. When the forces of Anktef finally attacked, they crashed into the walls of Thebes like a sea wave against a cliff. The city stood, and the Anktef's dreams of dominance began to crumble. This put Pharaoh Wakareketi in an extremely difficult situation. He could not afford infighting among his most loyal allies, not when his power was already so shaky. In a desperate attempt to prevent civil war from breaking out, the pharaoh called a great council at Het Nesut. The goal was simple: to stop the bloodshed before it engulfed the entire south. But Intef did not come. Instead, he sent a representative, a clear gesture of disrespect to the crown. To add insult to injury, Intef boldly proclaimed himself Great Lord of Upper Egypt, which meant that he claimed dominion over the entire south. As if that weren't enough, the ruler of Unet quickly joined him, and other cities that had until recently been loyal to Pharaoh began to waver in their allegiance. It was an open challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of Wakareketi. He knew that if he did not act quickly, Intef's ambitions would engulf the entire country. The king devised a cunning but risky plan. He sent one of his most loyal men, User, on a mission to take control of Gebtu, a city located between Thebes and Unet. The idea was simple but strategically important: to drive a wedge between Intef's strongholds and stop the expansion of his influence. If Intef could establish control over Gebtu, he would open the gates to the western desert, conquer the oases, and dominate the lucrative trade routes that linked Egypt to the rest of Africa. Worse, Abydos, Egypt's holiest city, would fall into the hands of the usurper. And that was unthinkable. Abydos was the graveyard of ancient kings and queens, the symbol of Egypt's royal heritage. The king could not allow this sacred land to fall into the hands of a rebel. A cold war began between Intef and User. Warriors were being prepared, mercenaries were being gathered. A clash was inevitable. Intef of Thebes struck first, launching an attack on Gebtu, but User and his troops held out and repelled the attack. Victory, however, came with a cruel twist of fate. Just as User was celebrating his triumph, death overtook him. With the loss of his most loyal commander, the king had to act quickly. He turned to another trusted man, Tiauti. Tiauti declared himself to be the king's confidant at the entrance to the desert of Upper Egypt. In those days, titles were not just words, they were weapons. It was a direct challenge to Intef, a challenge he could not ignore. But just as Intef was preparing for the decisive battle for the south, he died. The cause of his death remains a matter of debate to this day. After Intef's death, his son, who bore the same name, assumed the mantle of power. However, he had nothing in common with his father, at least as far as tactics were concerned. The younger Intef did not see himself as a warlord seeking power, but as something much greater. His first move was to seize the trade routes around the Kenna Bend, a key intersection along the Nile. Tiauti retaliated by building a new road link to bypass the blockade. This worked briefly, but the Theban army quickly regained control of the trade route. Abydos was now within the grasp of Intef, and with it, the heart of Egypt's spiritual and cultural identity. To control Abydos was to control Egypt's history. The younger Intef understood this perfectly. He began to see himself as the rightful pharaoh of all Egypt, and summoned priests whom he commanded to perform ancient rituals. Referring to ancient traditions, they invoked the gods and proclaimed a new title, Son of Ra. Intef was no longer just a pretender, he was pharaoh. The winds of loyalty turned, and the inhabitants of Nekhen, seeing where things were going, abandoned Wakareketi and pledged allegiance to Intef. Egypt was now officially divided. In the south, Intef of Thebes ruled as a self-proclaimed king, while in the north, Wakareketi clung to his crumbling throne. Two rulers claimed the same crown, but neither had enough power to strike the decisive blow. After years of waiting, Intef decided it was time to act. He marched with his army to the city of Abydos. During the battle, however, something terrible happened. The sacred ancient tombs were attacked and desecrated by soldiers from the north. This dishonorable act not only turned history against the king of the north, but also humiliated him in front of all of Egypt. To fail to protect the graves of the ancestors from his own soldiers meant only one thing: he was unworthy to rule. Intef was an extremely skilled military strategist. He realized that conquering province after province would be exhausting and costly, both in resources and lives. He needed a single blow aimed straight at the enemy's heart. For this, he prepared an ingenious maneuver. With a small but well-trained army, Intef encircled Abydos from both north and south. Left with no way out, the city's defenders were soon forced to surrender. Although casualties were significant for both sides, the northern army suffered the heaviest blow. Most of the North's soldiers were either killed or captured. With this victory, Intef became the legitimate ruler of Egypt. Becoming a pharaoh through conquest has never been easy. Throughout human history, such rule has been fraught with challenges, and Intef was no exception. Much of the north still remained beyond his control. The problem was that Thebes had always been perceived as a provincial city. To accept a king who rose from there was difficult for the northern Nomarchs, who did not want to submit to a ruler from the periphery of Egypt. For several years, Intef had to fight numerous skirmishes in the north until a fragile truce was finally reached. For the first time in more than 3 decades, Egypt was at peace. However, this peace would not last long. When an uprising broke out in Asyut, everyone knew that the days of peace were over. The new king of the north, Merikate, invaded the city with his army and put an end to the rebellion through a veritable massacre. Asyut was sacked and desecrated. Men, women, and children died mercilessly, and the cruelty exceeded even the harshest standards of the age. The inhabitants of Asyut felt deep bitterness at the slaughter and the oppression that followed, and many began to consider their options. It wasn't long before an idea occurred to them: to cross over to the other side. Now the new southern king, Mentuhotep II, wanted to prove himself as his ancestors in the past. His name means Montu is satisfied. Montu is the Theban god of war. It was a name worthy of a conqueror. Wasting no time, Mentuhotep II encircled and attacked the northern troops at Asyut, quickly capturing the city. But the greatest prize yet awaited him: Hetnesut, the royal city and pearl of the north. The storming of Hetnesut was relentless, a campaign that spared neither stone nor soul. Temples were razed, tombs desecrated, palaces reduced to ruins. Merikare's name and the memory of his reign were all but erased from history. But even after the defeat, some nobles did not give up. They retreated to the desert oases, hoping one day to regain power. But that never happened. Mentuhotep II pursued them relentlessly until the desert sands swallowed their resistance. Egypt became one again. Once Egypt was under his complete control, Mentuhotep II was given a new title, the Sematawi, he who unites the two lands. After decades of ruin and chaos, the first intermediate period was finally over. But victory did not mean peace. Mentuhotep II knew that power must be guarded with a watchful eye. To prevent another collapse, he created a mobile royal court, a network of spies and trusted emissaries who monitored local rulers and reported any suspicious movements. If anyone was collecting more taxes than necessary, the king was to know. If someone was secretly amassing an army, the king had to know. No one could hide in the shadows anymore. After almost 90 years, the great Egyptian civil war is finally over, and the so-called First Intermediate Period is coming to an end. The old Egyptian kingdom has fallen, but a new empire is about to rise from its ashes. If you are a fan of the subject of ancient Egypt, then don't miss our detailed account of the secrets of ancient Egypt's most hated female pharaoh, Nefertiti, and her husband Akhenaten, who radically changed the face and history of ancient Egypt.